Good morning from the Bishop Paiute Tribe in Bishop, California. My name is Brianna Vaughn, and I'm the Water Quality Program Coordinator here at the Tribe and have been since 2007. I've also been a member of the Tribal Exchange Network Group, formerly known as the Tribal Governance Group, or the TGG, and I've been on that group since 2010. That group advocates for tribal technical capacity building on a national level. And as a member who tries to represent tribes nationally, one of the things I'm often heard saying is tribes are not like states, and they're even less like each other. So in my time working for the tribe, I have seen many partnership projects and collaborations and other forms of communications between tribes and states. And the panelists that we have here today have firsthand experience with successful communications that have resulted in improved protection of natural resources, as well as strengthened tribal sovereignty. So with no further ado, we will hear from Bruce Jones, Nancy Schuldt, and Elizabeth Betancourt. Go ahead, Bruce.
All right, well, I'll go ahead and start with sharing of my slides. Let me know if you see these. Are we hooked up now?
Yes, we can see them.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, Emma and Brianna. It's a pleasure today to be here to share a little bit about our program and my personal experiences of working with Washington State tribes and agencies. I've been involved with the tribes in Washington State for the past 44 years. And over those years, I've been working with state agency staff, both in the field and office settings, to assist in the management of the region's natural resources. The types of jobs and responsibilities I've had the pleasure of doing over the years started with the Quinault Indian Nation, which is located on the coast of Washington State. But I was a cedar salvage technician, a forest practice forester, a hydraulic officer, environmental program manager, and a natural resource director. And then for the past 14 years, I've been with the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission and serve as their SHIAP section manager. Over the time period, both in the field and office, I have had different experiences while interacting with state agency staff. But overall, the state agency staff have been great to work with. I think the rub comes when state agency policies and regulations get in the way of doing what's right. For my presentation today, I would like to share a little about the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, the SHIAP program, or a review of our data management platform, and the projects that we developed in partnerships with Washington State, and then finally review a few of my personal thoughts about relationship building and between tribe and state staff. The Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission is the natural resource management support service organization for 20 tribes in Western Washington. Headquartered in Olympia, Washington, it employs approximately 65 employees. We have satellite offices in Burlington, which is in the northern part of the state, and in Forks, which is out on the coast. The Northwest Indian Fish Commission was created in 1974 following the USB Washington ruling known as the Bolt decision, which reaffirmed the tribe's reserve treaty fishing rights. The ruling recognized them as a natural resource co-manager with the state of Washington with an equal share in the harvestable number of salmon and steelhead returning annually to the state. For more information, I encourage you to check out our webpage. The Salmon and Steelhead Habitat Inventory and Assessment Program is a program which provides data management, analysis, and sharing assistance to our member tribes. We have a staff of 7 employees, and we work closely with the Point-to-Point Treaty Council to provide these services. Our goal is to advance the understanding of fish and wildlife habitat by providing information management and analysis program with the capacity to assemble, analyze, synthesize, deliver detailed and fundamental environmental information. In addition, as time permits, we also provide assistance to tribes across the United States. And one of those ways is through the Tribal Exchange Network Group, which Brianna mentioned. This group was formed to supply technical assistance to tribes in provide representation in the governance of the EPA's exchange network or e-enterprise. And if you're interested in finding out more about this group, check out our webpage. And if you know the tribes that could use assistance, refer them to our webpage, because we're looking to assist tribes across the country. And on this web page, you also find upcoming training opportunities and also our mentorship program, where we can actually get mentors out to help the tribes with whatever situation they come across. Now back to the SHIAP program. Within the SHIAP program, we have created a data management platform called Aquascape to support the tribal habitat strategy. The platform utilizes Esri software and the Microsoft SQL to manage, analyze, and share data. We include habitat data, population information, land management information. We have document management systems. We include fish management data. We have data exchanges included within this that allow the sharing of data between tribes and also with the state of Washington. And then we have the outreach information that our system that allows us to produce reports, web pages, web maps, data exchanges, and our partnership, of course, with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. The data exchanges that we have produced over the years, and since 2007, we have 6 of them, 5 are in production, 1's in development right now. All are available to the tribes at no charge. They're a SQL database with a front end. And if the tribe does not modify the exchange, any admin services that we supply to our 20-member tribes, any upgrades that have stuff are free to those members. And we have several tribes using the water quality exchange across the country. These data exchanges provide a means for tribes to manage their data internally and have the ability to easily share the data. The data is installed, or the system is installed within the tribe's firewall, and the data is protected. And the tribe actually has to push the data out to their partners for sharing. The Tribal Water Quality Database, or the WQX WQX Data Exchange, was our first exchange, and we built this to help support the tribe's EPA Section 106 Water Quality Grant reporting requirements. And it's one that's used across the country. And interesting fact is that this water quality exchange, when I started in 2007, I had no idea what the exchanges were. And the Washington Department of Ecology staff stepped up and provided mentorship to me and to my staff about what this was that we actually applied for, and helped us to set up the contracts to get this thing going. So it was a really good mentorship and a good cooperation from the state agency. Next one is the Juvenile Migrant Data Exchange. And this was our first exchange where we built it in partnership with the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. It supports the management and sharing of data, juvenile salmon steelhead information between the co-managers. The next one is the Adult Fish Data Exchange. And this exchange was built with partnership with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and also with the Recreational Conservation Office, another agency in the state. And supplies or provide an opportunity for us to share adult fish data on spawning ground surveys. Later, we just recently completed this earlier this summer, is the Fish Management Data Exchange. And this was another exchange that we built in partnerships with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Recreational Conservation Office, with the goal of developing a system that will provide assistance to the co-managers as they negotiate salmon seasons and salmon management and salmon and steelhead management. And this exchange will provide a means for sharing and management of adult and juvenile fish data. And now moving away from exchanges, I have 2 projects to share with you. One is this is the SWIFT-D, or a statewide integrated fish distribution data set. And basically what it does is, back in 2011, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and our program came together, and we realized that we are getting phone calls from across the country, from across the state, about the fish distribution, because the tribes and the states have dueling distribution data sets. And we had to come together and form a cooperative approach to managing this data. So We applied for an Exchange Network grant. We were awarded, and we worked together to build this data set and also to share this information with the general public. And it allowed us to merge our systems and provide one data set and one source for the local developers, cities, counties, resource managers to find fish distribution in the state of Washington. It is a product that's under development, and it continues to be updated by the local managers. So it definitely is a success of cooperation, collaboration between us. The next one is the State of Watershed report. This is a report that we produce at the Commission to share the current environmental conditions and trends and to help us inform the general public and also all of us working in resource protection about the actions needed to protect the resources, the region's watersheds and their habitats. The report provides a watershed by watershed characterization of actual conditions in the cumulative results stemming from our resource allocation decisions. Data used in this report comes from state, federal, and tribal resources, and we gladly share our analysis and the results with state agencies for their report and websites in which they utilize just currently in the 2020 report, the State of Our Salmon and Watersheds. This is the report the state put out. And they recognize the analysis and the reporting that we did. And it's just a nice working relationship we have with the state agencies. Now, as you could tell, a lot of this relationship is at the technical level, and we try to stay away from the policies and the politics of trying to protect the resources. So now I'd like to shift just the last couple of slides on lessons learned of my years of working with tribal and state agency staff. And from a tribal perspective, it is key to recognize the following, that the continued degradation and fragmentation of critical habitat has resulted in severely depressed salmon stocks, shellfish closures, access to hunting grounds and cultural sites, diminished resource base and resulting loss of habitat opportunities, whether fish, wildlife, cultural plants, along with the newly highlighted impacts from COVID, we found over the last 2 years is recreational impacts of people getting out of their homes have impacted tribal way of life. Key as co-managers, and I say that with the state and tribal staff, is that we need to commit ourselves to listen to each other and work collectively in efforts to evolve, adapt, and change to how we manage our shared natural resources. The challenge for us, the co-managers of these shared natural resources, be aquatic or terrestrial, is how to collectively improve upon our efforts to protect and sustain these resources for future generation, including understanding and respecting each other's viewpoint, our values, needs, and how we work towards our shared goals. And I have a couple slides here with some tidbits of information that I just collected over time. One is when you meet with tribes or you meet with state agency staff, you want to build a relationship with who you're going to work with. That's really important. Be respectful, of course. Federally recognized, the federally recognized tribes are sovereign nation. If you don't know what that means, look it up or ask your tribal partner. They will explain it to you. Tribes have a homeland. Through the treaties, they did not relinquish their rights to natural resources nor their land. The tribes are not moving from this area that they live in, so they have invested in a need to protect what's there and try to work with the other citizens that live in the area. We want to focus on the issue at hand and stay away from the politics. Be respectful, listen to understand. That's key. One of the things that we used in the early timber, fish, and wildlife negotiations in the state of Washington back in the late 80s was try to resolve each other's issues. That's important. If you hear an issue coming from someone you're talking to, try to help them resolve that issue, and that will help you move forward with consensus. Ask questions to if you don't understand, seek clarity, slow down a little bit and try to understand where the other person is coming from. Ask questions rather than make assumptions. Assumptions kill us all the time. We assume that we know what they're talking about. Follow through on your words, that's always key. Be upfront, let the other party know your limitations in making an agreement and moving forward. Focus on your tasks in front of you. Separate policy, agency management, technical solutions. Sometimes policy agents and agency directors get in the way of making technical progress. And identify why you're meeting. Set meeting outcomes, expectations up front. And then finally, one thing I looked at your webpage and one thing you might want to do is form a separate group or maybe even invite the tribes to your regional commission. Tribes are there and they're part of the environment. When your strategic plan says, draw upon our organizational values to strengthen culture, create a sense of community for staff. Well, that includes tribes and others in your community. And maybe even open up trainings. And when I saw a number of tribal staff logging onto this training, I think that's just a great opportunity to build relationships and build teams. And with that, I'll close, and this is my contact information. Please contact me. I'm available, my staff available. If you're a tribe listening to this, please log on to Tribal Exchange Network Group website, and you will learn some things about the TXG, and also if you need mentorship, it's there for you. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that fantastic presentation. I'm really excited to be handing things over to Nancy Schuldt, and I also want to make sure that everybody knows that they can ask questions throughout the presentation. Drop them in the chat, and I will moderate them at the end of the session. Also, to answer the question in the chat right now, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share it out online afterwards. It will be on our website, and we will email it to you. Take it away, Nancy.
Thank you, Emma. Are my slides appearing?
They are, but they are not yet in full screen.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much. I was really honored to be invited to be a panelist for the webinar today. I'm the Water Projects Coordinator for the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. I've had the pleasure of working in this position now for 24 years and was hired on to help the tribe begin developing a water quality standards and monitoring program. So we are one of the roughly 50 or so Native American tribes across the US who have federally approved water quality standards. And I just wanted to give you a sense of where we are located. You've always got to show the map, right? Our reservation is located about 20 miles inland from Lake Superior. We are just over 100,000 acres, and nearly half of that land base is either wetlands or open waters, lakes, streams, the St. Louis River. But I would also point out that as you were hearing from Bruce about reserved rights across the landscape, in addition to having reserved lands here, our reservation, Fond du Lac and the other tribes essentially in this upper Great Lakes region are also signatories to treaties that provided for off-reservation resource rights as well. These ceded territories really encompass almost the entire Great Lakes Basin on the US side. And for the state of Minnesota, essentially the northern half of the state are various ceded territories where tribes retain rights to hunt, fish, and gather. And I want to start off by saying that the kind of case study that I'm describing today that revolves around an important tribal, cultural, and natural resource, this is not just a Fond du Lac story. This is a story that is relevant to really all of the tribes in the state of Minnesota who have found that coordination, consultation, both formal and informal, is really important, but that we have found our most successful outcomes through working together and speaking with one voice through a unified effort. And so that's going to kind of be the theme of my comments today. So what I'm here to talk to you about is probably one of the most important natural and cultural resources to the tribes in the upper Midwest. Wild rice, Zizania aquatica, Zizania palustris are two of the species that are still growing up here. The Ojibwe people know it as Monoman. The Dakota people, who were here before the Ojibwe arrived, call it Scene. And it is a really, really central part of our natural resource and environmental protection and management efforts up in this region. The tribes here have long relied upon the sustainable harvest of Monoman, and it figures for the Ojibwe people very prominently in the migration story that describes the movement of the Anishinaabe people westward through the Great Lakes region, driven by prophecies that would lead them to the place where food grows upon the waters, Monoman. It is a really remarkable and unique natural and cultural resource. It is an indicator of really high quality and high functional aquatic ecosystems. It is an exceptionally nutritious grain. As I said, it's an annual grass, but it is much higher in protein and minerals and micronutrients than white rice, brown rice, other rices that are eaten around the world. But just as importantly, it is so essential to the preservation of traditional lifeways, the language, the culture of the native peoples in this region. In fact, the Ojibwe people believe that it is a relation, it is a sacred gift from the Creator, and if it were to disappear, the Ojibwe people themselves would cease to exist. And unfortunately, it has significantly diminished across its historic range. It used to be found pretty much everywhere across the continental United States east of the Rockies. But westward migration, human development, agriculture, industry, etc., has really changed the landscape and changed the really sensitive hydrology and water quality that is needed to maintain optimal wild rice habitat. And so there is quite a lot of effort on the part of the tribes in this region to manage and to restore and to protect what is left because it is so central. Then there is a state and tribal water quality criterion that has been approved for both the state of Minnesota and for the Fond du Lac and Grand Portage bands for wild rice waters of sulfate. 10 milligrams per liter is considered a sulfate concentration above which wild rice ceases to thrive and be abundant and sustainable. And that criterion has actually been on the books since the 1970s for the state of Minnesota. And since Fond du Lac and Grand Portage's tribal water quality standards were first approved by EPA 20 years ago. But, Bruce was talking about trying to avoid the politics and focus on the issues around the resources. Tribes began paying close attention and reviewing a number of major mining expansions and new projects that were being proposed. And as we were examining these environmental impact statements and draft permits, we had always assumed that the state was implementing that sulfate criterion when there were permits to be issued and in fact throughout their water quality program. Because we were, it had been an integral part of our monitoring program, and we assess and pay very close attention to the water quality status, including sulfate. But what we were seeing is that for the mining industry in northern and northeastern Minnesota, the permits did not include water quality based effluent limits for sulfate, even where there were no wild rice waters downstream that were receiving discharges from these facilities. Despite the fact that the state of Minnesota has a really robust and fairly well-funded water quality monitoring program, there was no statewide emphasis or prioritization for monitoring wild rice waters. In fact, back around the time that I first started working for the Fond du Lac Band, the state was going through water quality standards rulemaking for the waters in the Great Lakes Basin, the Lake Superior Basin. And there were several waters, wild rice waters that were included, named, identified in the rule that was revised at that time. But there was never any follow-up, as had been committed to by the state, to continue to work with the tribes to develop a really comprehensive and an updated statewide inventory of wild rice waters. There are probably over 2,000 wild rice flowages, rivers, lakes across the state of Minnesota. The state was not doing any assessment of wild rice waters to determine whether they were actually meeting the water quality standards associated with that designated use. And so by the time 2010 rolled around, tribes began to submit comments on the biennial impaired waters lists that the state was proposing and submitting to EPA, because they did not include any known impairments where wild rice waters exceeded the sulfate standard. And we have consistently elevated our concerns about the lack of Clean Water Act protection and implementation around wild rice waters to the EPA Region 5 staff, so that they can understand just how important it is to us. And we can share our perspectives, share our knowledge and understanding to EPA as well. In addition to actually implementing the standards for wild rice and doing extensive monitoring, assessment, restoration, et cetera, and in some cases even co-management across the state around this resource, the tribes have also invested in some basic research, some of it just basic fundamental ecological research around its growth needs, its water quality and sediment quality and hydrologic regime, but also specifically around the toxicity associated with sulfate. In fact, it isn't actually directly toxic, but ongoing research over the past 12, 14 years has demonstrated the mechanisms by which sulfate is reduced to sulfide in the anaerobic sediments of these wild rice waters. And that hydrogen sulfide is actually what causes the diminishment of the population. It prohibits or inhibits uptake of nitrogen as a really key part of the life cycle of wild rice. And in addition to doing basic research and monitoring and assessment, we've also turned to some other tools to help communicate the significance of this resource and to capture just how fundamental it is to the health and well-being of Native American people. Several years ago, we worked with the Minnesota Department of Health on a health impact assessment. And that process was really interesting for me because it was a way to integrate not only scientific and ecological knowledge, which is my background and training, but also tribal ecological knowledge. Tribes have been sustainably managing this resource for millennia, but also to tap into more the social sciences and an understanding of how these deeply held feelings around the social and cultural and spiritual elements of what wild rice or monoman represents to the Native American peoples. It was a really good opportunity to find new ways of communicating how central it is to the tribal communities. And where we, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, where we seem to be finding the most impact in terms of decisions and outcomes is when we have really worked hard to herd cats, as it were, and to get the 11 fiercely independent Ojibwe and Dakota tribes in the state of Minnesota working together and speaking with one voice. With that one voice, we have requested government-to-government consultation, not only with the state agencies, but all the way up to the governor's office, because the last several governors have had executive orders that required consultation and recognition of that unique relationship, even though it on the state and tribal basis, it isn't based in the treaties. It's a recognition of what it does mean for tribal sovereign nations to work with the state agencies and the state government. We have consistently provided public testimony and detailed technical comments. We've had informal consultation, working staff to share knowledge and data and perspectives. When there was some more recent rulemaking around the wild rice water quality standards, the tribes across the region created a wild rice task force, whereby we compiled and summarized a lot of our knowledge and understanding of Monoman scene. And we developed recommendations on restoration, on the regulatory framework, on monitoring and co-management of the resource across the state. We have continued to advocate for full, holistic Clean Water Act protections for Monoman. That includes a really robust and collaborative monitoring effort, states and tribes working together on that. We really expect to see sulfate water quality-based effluent limits in state-issued and PDES permits. We expect, where appropriate, to see anti-degradation demonstrations. And we expect to see the listing of impaired wild rice waters, where the data confirms that a wild rice water is not meeting the water quality standards associated with it. And all along the way, we have continued to engage with EPA Region 5. We've been continuing to advocate for stricter oversight on their part after years and years of failing to see the decision-making at the state level that we believe reflects what the Clean Water Act obligates state agencies to do, and what we believe that EPA in their Clean Water Act oversight authorities should be doing, because this relates to the federal trust responsibility to protect treaty resources. So earlier this year, after the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency submitted their 2020 303D list, despite extensive tribal consultation, despite our technical comments urging them to list known wild rice waters, despite our proposal of how the state could use their own assessment methodologies to do that assessment for this particular resource designated use water quality criteria. The 2020 impaired waters list did not include any impaired wild rice waters. So the Minnesota tribal leaders turned to Region 5, again, urging them to exercise their federal oversight and take action. And after formal consultation between the tribal leaders and tribal staff and the regional water quality managers and regional council at EPA Region 5, EPA came to a decision in March to partially disapprove the state's 303D list for its failure to include impaired wild rice waters. And I've got the link to the EPA webpage that has the public notice of a draft impaired wild rice water list that they have put out for public comment, and it is still out for review. And at the time that EPA made this decision, the tribal leaders again requested consultation with EPA, both at the regional level and at EPA headquarters, seeking assurances that tribal data, tribal knowledge, and input would be actually and fully considered as EPA went through the process of vetting public comments and coming up with a finalized impaired waters list. What we believe constitutes meaningful consultation is also an outcome or a decision that reflects how tribal input has actually been used, considered, and has shaped a decision, whether it's around a regulation or a policy or a guidance document. And so we were looking for reassurances from the agency that we could continue to provide data and share knowledge and understanding of where wild rice waters in the state of Minnesota were impaired, so that the next logical steps that are required under the Clean Water Act that would lead to their restoration, that might lead to more regulatory enforcement, could actually be queued up. So this action this year really marks a turning point in the Minnesota tribe's long battle to see appropriate Clean Water Act protections provided and enforced for this really priceless and irreplaceable cultural and natural resource. As always, we are looking to be able to sustain this resource for future generations. That is really at the heart of the work that we do with our tribal agencies and tribal governments. And that is the end of my story for today. I just want to say miigwech. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about Monoman.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I look forward to continuing the conversation in the Q&A. And Elizabeth, take it away.
Great, thank you, Emma. I'm going to echo Nancy in saying what an honor it is to be here today. I am Elizabeth Betancourt. I work currently, this is my second to last day with the Central Valley Water Quality Control Board, which is a regional body implementing the Clean Water Act and Porter Cologne Act here in California, protecting water quality for the state of California. I will be moving to the Department of Conservation as of next week. And so I wanted to make it really clear that I am transitioning, but I have been implementing a program from a state agency perspective, so a little different than our previous two speakers, focused on tribal beneficial uses in the Central Valley region of the regional water boards. So I have a few notes here, things I wanted to make sure to cover. We'll start maybe a little bit with what the Regional Water Board is. The California Water Board is part of the California Environmental Protection Agency, and as I mentioned, does implement the Clean Water Act here in California, as well as the state's Water Quality Protection Act, Porter Cologne. As with much of tribal history, which you've heard a little bit of today, relationships between tribes and the state is a little bit fraught. It is a challenge in California for a couple of reasons, particularly the unratified treaties between California Native American tribes and the United States. And these are really specific to California tribes, that issue. And then as the most western state in the continental US, some of the most violent and direct strategies for Indian removal happened here in California, and happened more recently than many of the more eastern parts of our nation. And so a lot of this sort of government relations between the sovereign nations as well as the state of California government are fraught and are a challenge. So those things combined with years of talking about environmental justice and tribal rights and sovereignty without maybe as real on the ground action as might be desired otherwise, means that this effort of designating tribal beneficial uses in California waterways is really significant. It's very important, certainly in and of itself, and the action that the designation will result in. Water resources, of course, are paramount to all of life on Earth, and particularly central to tribal traditional culture and practice. But this effort is also important from a relationship building and environmental justice perspective as well. So a quick background on beneficial uses. We probably have a pretty educated audience in this area, but just to make sure everybody's up to speed, beneficial uses are the practice of identifying current and sometimes goal uses of waterways, of water resources within waterways, waters of the state and waters of the United States. Associated with beneficial uses are water quality objectives. These are usually developed for the beneficial use with the most stringent water quality requirements. So if there's a water body with beneficial use of industrial use, agricultural use, and municipal use, you can imagine that the municipal use will receive the water quality objectives development, and that those water quality objectives are ubiquitous for all municipal use designations within the state of California. Sometimes, in some places in the state, we have site-specific water quality objectives, and that is likely something that will happen with our tribal beneficial use designations down the road. These are water quality objectives specific to the beneficial use designation on that particular waterway and specific to that particular type of use. Perhaps it'll be seasonal, perhaps it will be commensurate with the amount of fish consumed or shellfish, etc. So I've been talking a lot about beneficial uses and tribal beneficial uses in particular. Beneficial uses, again, are sort of an organizing principle for water quality protection. But until 2017, none of our beneficial uses here in the state of California were developed particularly to protect tradition and culture or tribal rights and sovereignty. And so in 2017, that was corrected after a couple of years of working with tribes and other stakeholders to develop beneficial use definitions that encompassed two main thrusts of protecting waterways for tribes. And that is cultural beneficial use, protecting tribal tradition and culture, so protecting waterways that are used for ceremonies, waterways hosting riparian species used for basket weaving or other engineering projects. That is kind of what falls under tribal tradition and culture. And then the second beneficial use falling under the tribal beneficial uses heading is tribal subsistence fishing. This is shortened to T-sub in the beneficial use vernacular. And tribal subsistence fishing covers certainly the collection, capture, and consumption of fish, but also shellfish, riparian species, vegetative species for consumption, etc. And so those two beneficial uses are collectively known as tribal beneficial uses, and both come with water quality objectives for mercury. Other water quality objectives will need to be developed in the future. So as you might imagine, as with any process that addresses regulatory oversight, there is a significant burden of bureaucracy in the process. So we have to accommodate regulatory requirements, certainly state and federal generally regulatory requirements, but specifically in California, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act process. So this process had to, of course, comply with that, but it also needed to build in environmental justice accommodations and considerations. For me, developing the approach to the designation of tribal beneficial uses, that was particularly important. And important for a number of reasons, primarily though, because the designation of tribal beneficial uses suggests that tribes need to be involved in the process, of course, and in fact our regulations require that tribes be the entity to confirm the designation prior to a board even adopting that designation into a basin plan. So tribes must be involved in the process, but also I saw this as an opportunity to expand not only our agency capacity in working with tribes, but also expanding participating tribes capacity in working with the agency and working within a regulatory sector. And so we wanted to create a project with a very low, even no bar to entry into the process. We here in California, actually in the Central Valley region in particular, which runs from the Oregon border all the way down to the Tehachapis. It is the largest regional board in the state of 9 regional boards, and encompasses probably, gosh, I think it's about 25 to 30% of the state geography as a whole. There are a little more than 100 tribes in our region who are located in or have historic interest in, trading, migration in the Central Valley region. And that includes federally recognized and federally unrecognized tribes. Here in California, we recognize all tribes who have registered with the Native American Heritage Commission with the state. So in the state's eyes, there actually is not a difference from a regulatory perspective between federally recognized or unrecognized tribes. But we know from working with tribes that those two categories of tribal governments have very different capacities. Their economic resources are often very different. Federally recognized tribes often have an income source and are able to hire environmental staff. Federally unrecognized tribes often do not have an income source specific for the tribe and often do not have staff, and so rely on tribal members who often volunteer to represent the tribes in the capacity of regulatory development and participation. So we want to grow the pool of tribes who are interested in and able to participate in the regulatory process. And we want to show the positive effects of participating in the regulatory process. We know that not every time the tribe participates in a state or federal agency's process, it's not always positive. So we wanted to show that this can be a positive effort. You will see the fruits of your labor, and we want to do that expeditiously, knowing that for hundreds of years now, tribal rights and sovereignty on these waterways have not been recognized. And so it is incumbent upon us to actually make that progress happen. And then we wanted to take advantage of the political conditions supporting tribal sovereignty. So our last few speakers spoke a bit about avoiding the politics, which certainly can move a process along more quickly. But when we come to a policy process, actually changing the basin plans in the state of California, that is inherently political. And being California, being who we are with the administration that we have in the governor's office at the moment, we have significant support for the respect of tribal rights and sovereignty, as well as for conversations around the land back effort, for example, looking at returning state lands to tribes. That inherent support for tribal rights and sovereignty here in California made us feel like we need to get this started as soon as possible and have some early successes, because we don't know what's going to happen down the road. We had a recent recall election, which thankfully did not change our administrative oversight here in California, but we have another gubernatorial election coming up next year, and we want to make sure to make progress while the getting's good, to be able to show precedent as far as respecting those tribal rights and sovereignty on waterways. So I'm going to talk a little bit to each of those points here, starting with the low bar to entry and growing tribal capacity. We wanted to start with CUL, with the cultural and traditional designation on higher quality waterways. And we did that for two reasons. One is because the cultural beneficial use designation requires a lower bar of evidence. It's more qualitative evidence than the tribal subsistence fishing designation, which requires quantitative, actually data heavy evidence to support our board in making the decision to incorporate that beneficial use into the basin plan. CUL also has more achievable mercury objectives. I mentioned that the tribal beneficial uses actually come with mercury water quality objectives, which is pretty unique for beneficial use designations. And the water quality objective for mercury for the cultural and traditional beneficial use is much lower and thus more achievable for us here in the Central Valley, the recipient of much of our 1800s mining tailings waste, and thus a heavy burden of mercury in our region. So focusing on those two benefits made us really decide to start with the cultural designation. And then we wanted to accommodate both low resourced and high resource tribes, again, federally unrecognized and federally recognized tribes. And so what most tribes usually have is traditional practitioners who are familiar with historic cultural practices. And so we decided from an evidentiary support perspective that we would require at the very baseline a letter from the tribal council indicating the tribe's wish to designate a waterway or multiple waterways for the cultural beneficial use designation. This again speaks to our low to no bar of entry effort and our desire to design a process where all tribes who are interested would be able to participate. So as far as early successes, and I know I'm out of time in a couple minutes here, so I'll try to wrap this up, but let's see here. I mentioned the gubernatorial support for tribal sovereignty and the lower requirements for a cultural designation, the lower evidentiary support requirements. And so really achieving early success in this process is possible. While basin planning amendments usually take years to accomplish, we think that we will be able to bring basin plan amendments to our board in October of 2022. So that means when we started this whole thing, when I started brainstorming, how can we do this back in September of 2020, that's a little over 2 years of actually bringing something to our board, which is pretty exceptional from a regulatory standpoint. That's not the end of the road, of course, but the designation of cultural beneficial uses will help us in creating a template for moving forward with the more challenging beneficial use designations. So we're building capacity again with the tribes, and starting with something requiring a much lower level of evidentiary support, but we're also building capacity with the state, with us, in better understanding how to work with tribes effectively. So I see Emma, and I'm just going to wrap it up there, Emma.
That was great. I wish we could go on all day. I want to make sure that we have a few minutes for questions, and then we will do our best to connect everybody to follow up for more information. It looks like there's a lot of interesting things happening in the sidebar. Nancy and Bruce, would you guys like to come back and join us for the Q&A? And then while you guys are coming back, I think that first question I'm going to ask is based on the lessons learned between Minnesota and the other states and regions we've heard from and tribes around the water quality criteria development and implementation, how can state programs better collaborate over shared goals for water quality and tribal historical, cultural, and environmental resources? And I guess this was originally for Nancy, but I think everybody probably has thoughts on it. So Nancy, go ahead.
Well, I have to say, the tribes in Minnesota actually have had a lot of conversations, coordination, informal consultation with the MPCA around wild rice water quality standards, around permits and permit limits, around the impaired waters list. We've had a lot of discussion, a lot of sharing of information, but unfortunately, what it appears to be to us is that primarily industry has a lot of clout, no surprises. And not only does industry have a lot of clout, they exercise that through litigation, through leaning on their legislators, to the point where we see the state legislature passing new rules that essentially handicap the agency from doing their job under the Clean Water Act. And that's a really unfortunate scenario for everybody and for the resource, for sure. We absolutely are immersed in the complexities that politics plays around the regulatory world. And all I can say is that we continue to focus on the science and what we believe the Clean Water Act says and requires. We continue to elevate our concerns to EPA because of their oversight authority. And we continue to engage with the state agencies, offering to do collaborative monitoring, offering to collaborate on an assessment methodology, et cetera, trying to provide the very best we can in terms of what we believe the resource warrants and what our shared responsibilities and our co-management roles require. It's an ongoing struggle. I think that there's some great people working at the state agency that have a lot of roadblocks foisted upon them. But we will continue to work through it as best we can.
Great. So we are almost at our time, but do you all have a few more minutes to stay on and answer a few questions, or should we wrap it up and direct people to questions via email? Great. Well, then I have another question originally for Bruce, but anybody who would like to answer it can also jump in after Bruce has a chat. But what can Eastern Native Americans learn from the Western tribes as they reestablish Native homelands and the conservation of those lands?
Well, could be a conference by itself. I think there are different experiences from East Coast to West Coast. By the time the settlers got to the West Coast, there was a lot of treaties going on and different circumstances that the tribes came under. But as far as resource management and working with state agencies, there are lessons that could be shared, and also solutions like what I shared earlier with our data exchanges. They are there for you, and also with the Tribal Exchange Network group. There's a whole group. We have a member there from Maine. We have members from Oklahoma and California, and I'm in Washington. And so we're scattered across that we can bring some knowledge and share what we know. Like I say, I work with a consortium of 20 tribes. The road to our relationship, the tribes' relationship in Western Washington with the state agencies has not been easy. When the state went through a water standards regulation upgrade, about 8-10 years ago, they did not recognize tribal data, our data. And we challenged that. EPA then disapproved the state's proposal. And the state had to go back and consider the tribe's data. And then just recently, earlier this year, May, one of our tribal leaders called the governor a snake. So in the paper, front page. Because of what he did through the legislature. And the relationship's there. There's, just like what Nancy said, the legislature is not individuals in a bubble. They are driven by business and corporations, and there's a lot of noise in their world. And so as far as information, we have a lot of water quality and also natural resource management experience on the West Coast that we are glad to share with any East Coast tribe and struggle. So I'll stop there.
Bruce. And then, yeah, go ahead, Brianna.
You know, I love Bruce and Nancy's stories. They've been through so much and been so successful in what they do. And it didn't happen overnight for either of them. That's why it's really a story, and it's a story that they're a part of. And Bruce's group puts together a State of the Watersheds report. And I'm guessing that Bruce might have a copy on his desk with him. Can you just hold that up? Because I really think that it's so impressive. It's filled with tribal data. They put it out, I believe it's every 5 years. And this is not a dry black and white report. This is a beautiful hardbound report with glossy pages and, oh, that one's not hardbound, I lied. But it really just shows the work that they do and that they compile and that they stand behind their science. And that's what they have to back up their work and to get them where they've got them. So I think it's just so impressive. And you probably also have a link that you could throw in the chat, huh, Bruce? You're on mute.
Nope, Bruce, you're
Sorry about that. Yes, I will throw that up. That was in one of my slides, but that report is basically, we started to produce that report a number of years ago, and basically it summarizes our environmental studies. Our mean the 20 tribes. The 20 tribes helped build this report, and each report that comes out, my job is to herd the cats and get all these tribal scientists together to have a message of their individual watersheds, and then we roll it up in a regional perspective. So I will post that link up there on the chat so that you'll have that. But thanks, Brianna.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And then one of our attendees just wants you to repeat the name of that source, that huge document you just lifted up.
Oh, it's the name of it is the State of Our Watersheds Report. And it's the report of the 20 tribes in Western Washington.
Wonderful.
And I'll put a
Thank
link
you.
in the chat. So
Awesome. And oh, we're getting, hold on. Gotta scroll back up to the questions I was going to ask. So often when it comes to TNDLs and water quality standards and other water quality policies, tribes and other interested parties may have the limitation of only being officially invited to comment during a public comment period, which I know has been a source of frustration and challenge across the board. How have any of you established formal or informal communication opportunities to improve this on a regular basis, so to gather input from these important governments in the region and also Elizabeth, the unfederally recognized tribes as well?
I could jump in with some of the things that have happened here. The state of Minnesota has one agency that is responsible for Clean Water Act implementation, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. We also have a DNR. And so with regards to the mining industry, which seems to be kind of the focus of a lot of the stressors on our resources, our shared resources, and the source of a lot of controversy about enforcement and the regulatory framework. We have actually instituted what started out as quarterly meetings between the states and tribes around mining, around all of the mining projects, the status of permits and environmental reviews, learning from each other about processes and about concerns and information bases. And that has continued since 2008. We've developed policies with the state agencies around consultation and meaningful consultation. And the state agencies have all done training and have named tribal people as their liaisons from their state agencies to the 11 Minnesota tribes. And we have instituted policies such as early notification around a draft permit, for instance. We get to see it before it goes out to the public. So those are some kind of incremental changes that we have worked on together to continue to keep the lines of communication open and to continue to try to find ways to work together on shared resource management and protection.
Thank you. Elizabeth, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I will say California has much of what Nancy just described as far as consultation requirements. And if folks are interested, we have Assembly Bill 52, AB 52, which was passed, gosh, I think in the early 2010s, that mandates tribal consultation. But we have found that much of that effort only reaches like maybe 20% of tribes because they have to have staff there in their tribe to be able to respond to a notification that a document, is in progress of being developed, or do you want to hear about this wastewater treatment plant expansion? They actually have to have staff to be able to respond to that because there are deadlines for response times. And so what we found with the tribal beneficial use effort is that continual and varied outreach to tribes. So we send hard copy letters, we send emails, we make phone calls, and we do all of that more than once is really central and essential to making sure that we as a state agency are not just going through the motions of trying to get tribes involved, but are actually, in fact, creating a space where tribes feel welcome and continually invited to participate.
That is fantastic. Oh, Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say our situation is a little bit different with our 20 tribes, is that we're tribally court recognized in the state, and also we have co-management duties and responsibilities in this state for resource management. So, but I think that if there are teams built within the technical staff that know that from the state agency side, that know there's tribes out there collecting data, and they're getting ready to promulgate a new regulation or something, state agency staff could reach out. I'm not sure the process, the local politics of the states, but I know that we get phone calls, informal phone calls from agency staff talking about issues coming forward, whether at the governor level, the legislative level, and we try to respond to those privately, so we protect each other and not burn those communication routes. But I think the main thing is build, like one of my first tips of advice is to build those relationships, and that's how you kind of go around this walls that are put up on regulatory processes.
Thank you, Bruce and Elizabeth and Nancy and Brianna. I'm sure we could continue talking about this for like a full week-long conference, maybe someday in person in the future. But for now, thank you all so much. I will send out the kind of resources in the chat. There's a whole bunch of cool things that are going on in the chat, and the recording of this session in the next day or so. And again, I want to reiterate, thank you so much. And also that if you have ideas for future webinars in the National 303D TMDL webinar series, reach out to me. You will be getting an email from me in the next couple of days, so you can always respond to that email. And I'd love to talk about what you want to hear next. And I look forward to seeing you all at future events.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Brianna.
Thank you.